It's 8:45 in the morning on January 4th, 1967, and a man is about to die on live radio, not in a hospital, not quietly. In front of a film crew, a support team, and a lake, so still it looks like glass, in exactly 90 seconds. His boat is going to hit 300 miles an hour, flip backwards through the air, and come apart like a paper plane hitting a wall. And in those final seconds, his voice, calm at first, then not, is going to be captured on a radio transmitter and preserved for the rest of human history. You are about to hear those actual words. But before you do, you need to understand something. This man didn't die because something went wrong. He died because everything had already gone right, over and over again, for 12 straight years, and he couldn't make himself stop. This is the story of Donald Campbell and the last 90 seconds of his life. Here's what almost nobody knows going in. This crash wasn't the beginning of a story. It was the ending of one that started decades earlier, in the shadow of a father who once looked at his own son and said, essentially, that the boy would never be like him. That one sentence is going to explain everything that happens on this lake. Keep it in mind, because we're coming back to it. Donald Malcolm Campbell was born in 1921 in Surrey, England, into a family name that already meant something enormous. His father, Sir Malcolm Campbell, was one of the most famous men on the planet, a record breaker who, across the 1920s and 30s, set roughly 13 world speed records on land and water, and became the first human being to drive a car faster than 300 miles per hour. Malcolm Campbell wasn't just successful, he was a legend, the kind of man whose name got shouted in newsreels and printed on the front page. And legends, as it turns out, cast very long shadows over the people who have to grow up standing inside them. By most accounts, Malcolm never fully believed his son had what it took. He's said to have remarked that Donald was built differently, that he'd never be the man his father was. Imagine hearing that as a kid. Then imagine your father dying in 1948, before you ever got the chance to prove him wrong to his face. That's exactly what happened to Donald. And from that point on, his entire life became an argument he was having with a dead man. He teamed up with his father's old chief mechanic, Leo Villa, and set out to do what his father did, but faster, further, and on machines that hadn't even existed in his father's era. He started with his dad's old boat, Bluebird K4, which was promptly destroyed in a horrific crash in 1951. Donald walked away from that wreck alive, which, given how this story ends, is almost unbearably ironic. Most people would have taken a crash like that as a sign to slow down. Donald took it as a rough draft. He commissioned an entirely new boat, a jet-powered hydroplane called Bluebird K7, fitted with an engine cannibalized from a military fighter jet. This wasn't a boat that was supposed to plane gracefully across the water. It was a machine designed to skim the surface at speeds that, at the time, sounded like science fiction, a boat that essentially had to fly a few inches above the lake to go as fast as Donald needed it to go. Keep that in mind. The line between hydroplane and aircraft is thinner than you'd think, and by the end of this story, that thin line is going to be the whole problem. On July 23, 1955, on Ullswater in England's Lake District, Donald Campbell became the first person in history to officially break 200 miles per hour in a jet-powered hydroplane, 202.32 miles per hour to be exact. And here's the thing about people who spend their whole lives trying to outrun a ghost. One record is never enough. Over the next 9 years, Campbell broke his own water speed record 7 separate times, mostly right there on Coniston Water, the very lake this story keeps circling back to. Each attempt faster, each attempt more dangerous, each attempt chipping away, just a little more, at the line between record-breaking and reckless. He wasn't just chasing a number anymore. He was negotiating with it, squeezing out 5 more miles an hour here, 10 more there, the way a gambler keeps sliding chips back onto the table because walking away now, this close, feels impossible. Then came 1964, the single greatest year of his career, and in hindsight, maybe the beginning of the end. In July, on the dry salt flats of Lake Eyre, Australia, Campbell set a new land speed record of over 403 miles per hour in a jet-powered car. 5 months later, on Lake Dumbleyoung, also in Australia, he broke the water speed record too, 276.33 miles per hour. To this day, he remains the only person in history to set both a land and a water speed record in the same calendar year. It should have been the perfect ending to the story. Father, finally, unmistakably, proven wrong. But here's a detail that almost never makes it into the highlight reels. Those close to him said that after Australia, Donald wasn't triumphant. He was hollowed out. Friends and crew members described him as physically and mentally drained in a way he'd never been before. He had just done something no human being had ever done, and somehow it wasn't enough to make the ghost go quiet. One more thing before we go back to the lake, because it's going to matter later, and I promise you it will break your heart when it comes back around. Donald Campbell was deeply superstitious. Before every single record attempt, he carried a small stuffed teddy bear into the cockpit with him. Its name was Mr. Woppet. It rode with him through every crash, every triumph, every death-defying run of his entire career. Remember that name. Remember that bear. We are not done with him. Now back to Coniston Water, in England's Lake District, the morning of January 4th, 1967. Campbell had come here to do something no human being had ever done on water, break 300 miles per hour. Not close to it, past it, and almost nothing about the lead up to that morning had gone smoothly. The weather was brutal. It was the dead of British winter, and the water refused to sit still and calm the way a record attempt like this required. Weeks earlier, at speed, Bluebird K7 had struck a duck during a test run, damaging the hull and forcing the engineering team, led by designer Ken Norris, to scramble through a series of last-minute modifications, including an entirely new tail fin bolted onto the boat just days before the attempt. A brand new stability component, untested under full race conditions, on a machine already skating along the ragged edge of what physics would allow. Sponsors were breathing down his neck. Journalists were camped out on the shoreline in the January cold, waiting for a headline. And there's a detail here that rarely makes it into the story, but probably should. This entire expedition was bleeding money. The costs of housing a crew, chartering the lake, and keeping Bluebird race ready through a miserable winter were mounting by the week. And every day of bad weather that forced a delay was a day closer to Campbell losing the funding to even attempt the record at all. The world was watching, the bills were piling up, and the world does not like to wait. People close to him said that on the morning of the run, Donald seemed different, quieter than usual. Somewhere else in his own head, one of his biographers has suggested he may have sensed, on some level, that something was wrong, that this wasn't going to be like the 7 times before it. We can't know that for certain. Nobody can climb inside a dead man's last thoughts, and it's easy to read tragedy backward into a man's mood once you already know how his morning is going to end. What we do know is exactly what happened next, because almost all of it is on the record, minute by minute, second by second. At 8:45 a.m., Bluebird K7 slid into the water. The first run, heading south, was a success. A blistering average of 297.6 miles per hour. That alone was already a new world record. The plan, agreed upon in advance with his entire team, was simple and non-negotiable. Return to shore, refuel, and critically, wait. Wait for the wash from that first run, the disturbed water rippling across the lake, to settle back into stillness. Only then attempt the return run. Donald Campbell did not wait. Over the radio, he told his team he was turning around immediately for the second run. Nobody stopped him. Maybe nobody could have. Everyone on that crew had learned, over 12 years, that once Donald Campbell decided something, arguing was a waste of breath. Bluebird turned back into the measured course and began to build speed again, this time, across water that hadn't had the chance to go still. This is the part of the story where I need you to understand just how fast actually is here. By the time Bluebird reached the start of the measured kilometer, she was already traveling faster than 320 miles per hour. Faster than the first run, on water that was working against her instead of with her. For a moment, it looked like it might actually work. Then the boat started to feel it. Witnesses on the course boats described what's called tramping, the hull bouncing violently from one spunson to the other, refusing to settle, refusing to find the smooth, flat plane it needed to stay stable. Each impact a little more violent than the last. Each bounce shaving away a tiny bit more of the boat's control. Nobody on the shore could do a single thing about any of it. All they could do was watch and listen. And then, over the radio, Donald's voice came through. Calm, almost conversational, like a man giving a routine update to his crew. Pitching a bit down here, probably from my own wash, straightening up now on track, rather close to Peel Island. If you didn't know what was coming, it would sound almost boring. That's what makes it unbearable in hindsight. 150 yards. That's how close Bluebird K7 was to the end of the measured mile when the front of the boat lifted clean off the surface of the water. Not a bounce this time, a genuine takeoff. Rising at a 45-degree angle into the cold morning air, the engine flamed out from the sudden loss of airflow, and the abrupt drop in thrust threw the nose even higher. Onlookers on the shoreline watched, frozen, as an entire speedboat, one of the most advanced machines on the planet, began to somersault through open air. And that's when the voice on the radio changed. Not into a scream, into something quieter and far more disturbing, the sound of a man narrating his own death in real time, because there was nothing else left for him to do. I can't see anything. I've got the bows out. I'm going. And then, nothing. Bluebird K7 completed a full rotation in the air and slammed back down into Coniston Water nose first, at a speed in excess of 300 miles per hour. The impact was so violent, it tore the boat apart just forward of the air intakes, precisely where Donald Campbell was sitting. He was killed instantly. What remained of the hull cartwheeled across the surface of the lake before finally sinking beneath it. From the moment Bluebird left the water to the moment she disappeared beneath it, less than 5 seconds had passed. A man who had spent his entire life trying to outrun his father's shadow was gone in less time than it took you to read this sentence. But here's where the story does something that most disaster documentaries never get to do. It doesn't end at the crash. It goes quiet for 34 years, and then it comes back. When rescue boats reached the wreckage site, they found almost nothing large enough to recover. No body, barely any trace of the boat itself. But floating on the surface of the lake, bobbing gently among the debris, was one small object that had survived completely intact. Mr. Woppet, the lucky teddy bear, found floating alone on the water with no boat and no pilot anywhere near it. Donald Campbell's body and the vast majority of Bluebird K7 sank into roughly 140 feet of water and simply vanished. Britain went into mourning. On January 28, 1967, just over 3 weeks after his death, Campbell was posthumously awarded the Queen's Commendation for brave conduct. His wife, Tonia, and his daughter, Gina, were left with a funeral that had nothing to bury. No body, no boat. Just a lake that had swallowed both and given nothing back. For 34 years, Donald Campbell rested somewhere at the bottom of Coniston Water, and nobody on Earth knew exactly where. Then, in the year 2000, an engineer and diving enthusiast named Bill Smith decided he was going to find him. This wasn't some official government operation, it was one man, obsessed with a story that had haunted an entire generation of British schoolchildren, who decided to spend his own time and his own money doing what nobody else had managed in 3 decades. Smith spent months searching the lake bed with sonar equipment, mapping fragments of wreckage scattered across 140 feet of cold, dark, near-freezing water, slowly piecing together the outline of a boat that had once been the fastest machine on the surface of any lake on Earth. And then, in May of 2001, his team found something that made headlines around the world. Donald Campbell's body, still inside the wreckage, still wearing his racing suit, remarkably preserved after more than 3 decades submerged in the cold and the dark. 34 years after his voice went silent on that radio transmitter, Donald Campbell was finally coming home. On September 12, 2001, he was buried properly, finally, in a cemetery in the village of Coniston. And in one of the most quietly devastating details of this entire story, his coffin was carried across the lake by boat on the way to the funeral. The route it traveled passed directly over the measured kilometer where he made his final, fatal run. 34 years later, the water gave him one last pass across the exact same stretch that had taken his life. Today, the fully restored Bluebird K7 sits on permanent display at the Ruskin Museum in Coniston, repainted in her original blue and gold, engine intact, looking exactly as she did on the morning she left the water for the final time. Volunteers spent years piecing her back together, rivet by rivet, some of them the same age as the men who originally built her. People travel from all over the world just to stand in front of her, to look at the machine that both made a man immortal and took everything from him in the space of 5 seconds. So what actually happened here? Strip away the records and the headlines, and what you're left with is a much simpler, much sadder story. A man who spent his entire adult life trying to prove he wasn't built differently than his father, and who, in the process of chasing an impossible number, ran out of road, ran out of time, and ran out of chances to slow down. Every single record he broke bought him only a few months of peace before the need to prove himself came roaring back. He got his 300 miles per hour, or something extremely close to it. He got it for maybe 4 seconds, and then it took everything else he had. His last words are still sitting in an archive somewhere. 3 sentences long, calm right up until they weren't. And honestly, that might be the most haunting part of this entire story. Not the crash itself, but how ordinary he sounded right before it happened. Like a man checking in with his team. Not like a man who was about to become one of the most famous deaths in the history of motorsport. If this kind of story is the kind of thing you want more of, real people, real machines, and the exact moments that change the rules of speed forever, subscribe, because this channel exists for stories exactly like this one. And next time, we're going back onto the track for another driver whose story is just as unbelievable, and whose ending you will not see coming either.